quite like building vintage classic kits because they sort of hark back to the early days when I first started modelling. Airfix was my first experience, and these are the kind of era of the kind of kits that I was building. Granted, they'd been around for a number of years, but we weren't seeing the more higher quality designs that Airfix currently have. So I like messing around with these vintage classic kits, and I have also wanted to build some dioramas recently. So I thought, when this one came out, why not do the Bristol Bloodhound Vintage Classic kit as part of a little diorama? I mean, after all, you do get enough stuff in there to get started with a diorama. You just need to add a few extra scenic details. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Airfix Vintage Classic Bristol Bloodhound kit, that's a mouthful, and see if I can turn this one into a fun little diorama. Let's get it out of the box and onto the workbench. This was a kit that I had on a pre-order when Airfix announced that it was going to be part of their range, so I was pretty excited for it. I've never actually experienced this kit before, I'd never built it in my youth, but I think I remember seeing it and thinking, that would be fun to have a go at. As usual, I'm going to pop a list of the painting products and other things that I used during this build on the screen now, to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you want to have a go at this one for yourself. I have already done a full unboxing of this kit, so for a deeper look inside the box at the plastic parts and instructions, take a look at that dedicated video. In this one, however, I'm going to be looking at how this one is to build and what I think about it at the end. As normal, I begin the build by removing the parts that I need from the sprues using my side cutters, and then sanding away any excess flash or shaving away mold seams using a sharp knife. There are a number of figures included in this set, but I don't want them on their display bases. I'm going to carefully cut them away, and as mentioned, try and clean up the mold seams on the parts using a sharp knife. For these figures, I drilled a small hole in the bottom of their feet and superglued in a short length of wire. This will make them easier to handle whilst also giving them a manner to attach to the diorama later. I gave them a base coat of black spray paint from Hobbycraft, and then a zenithal highlight using white spray paint from Hobbycraft. I'm going to paint these figures using this Army Painter Speed Paint starter set. It's thanks to my Model Club members on the screen now that I can actually afford to get new products or product sets like this in order to try out. So thanks to these guys for their extra support, and if you'd like to join them and find out what kind of perks a Model Club member gets, take a look at the links in the description. First up, I used peachy flesh on all of their skin. As these are speed paints, they sort of do the highlights and the recesses all in one go. I then mixed up Grim Black and Beowulf Blue to a more appropriate colour for RAF uniforms. I used Satchel Brown on their hair, and Pallid Bone on the dog. Their boots would be painted in Grim Black. Vallejo White would be used on the military policeman's hat and his strap across the body. And at this point I'm going to consider my figures done. This didn't take particularly long given that it's speed paints. I wouldn't consider myself a figure painting expert, but I think from normal viewing distances, this finish is good enough. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the parts for the missile. Humbrol liquid poly is going to be used to glue everything together, and I started by joining the two halves of the main missile components together, and then sanding down the seams to make them look a little more flush. These fins were then glued at the back, and some more fins glued further towards the centre. This sort of rear mounting part was glued into place at the back of the missile, and then the extra rockets and fins on the sides were glued together as they come in two halves as well. These extra rockets were then glued onto their mounting points on the side of the missile, and the mount we glued at the back. And that's pretty much it. Not a complicated build. So now it's time to prime. I'm going for the Tamiya Fine Surface Primer in white, and after a few thin coats I've got a nice white missile. I carefully painted the side booster rockets in Humbrol 24 Trainee Yellow. In hindsight, this would have been easier, a lot easier, to have done with them not attached to the model. But it is possible with a little bit of patience and careful brush control. I used some masking tape at the top of the nose cone and then painted the nose cone in black. This piece of tape should give a nice solid edge between the Vallejo black and the white undercolor. The nozzles on the rockets were painted in Vallejo gunmetal. And whilst there are no decals included in the kit, I did see some images online which had RAF roundels on the side of the missile. I've got these Spitfire 144th scale transfers which I got as extras from Beacon Models when I bought one of their kits recently. So I used some decal fix to apply these to the side of the missile. And actually they seem to be about right, going off the images I'd seen online. When they had cured, a small amount of matte varnish would be painted over the top just to seal them in. And that is my Bloodhound missile complete. You will notice that I did actually pick out the back of the ramjets using some gunmetal as well. Now it's time to move on to the launcher for the missile. This does have a little play value and can be designed to rotate on its little stand if you are careful. This is done by gluing the retaining pin through the stand into the base. These side parts are then glued into position, and then this pipework component is glued in on the support rails. The lifting mechanism is designed with a bit of play value in mind as well, and if you do it correctly you can have a missile which can be raised and lowered on this launching platform. This is a little bit of a fiddly step, but by the end of it I did actually manage to get this launcher to be able to be raised and lowered. But I think that had it put up any more of a challenge, I would have been content to just glue it in either the raised or the lowered position. The only real way that this functionality is designed into the kit, however, is sort of by sandwiching different parts over the top of others, so careful application of the glue was necessary. And with that now done, it's time to move on. I'm now turning my attention to the trailer. The side parts are glued to the top part. And again, if you are careful with how you build this, you could have a trailer with a bed which raises and lowers, but actually I don't think I was successful with mine, so I just glued it into one position. The rear bed support is glued into its position at the back. And then I took a little bit of time to assemble the cradle for the missile. Again, this is a fiddly step, but this cradle is then glued onto the support arms. And I just thought it would fall apart, so I just glued all of this together in a solid raised position. The trailer is designed to have a pivoting front axle, however, but I did find I had to open up the hole for it with a drill bit. I then installed the relevant components, gluing in the axle mounts and the towing arm for the trailer. And with that all done, it was time to prime again. So I'm using Humbrol number 1 grey primer on the launcher, the trailer and all of the wheels. And the next paint I'm going to use is this SMS British Green Lacquer paint. I thought this would be the most appropriate colour for the kind of trailers and equipment that the RAF were using at that time. This lacquer paint is airbrush ready, so it was simply loaded into the airbrush and applied over all of these parts. As it's lacquer based, it dries very quickly, and I could build up subsequent layers in a short amount of time. When that was done, I painted the tyres on all the wheels in Vallejo black, and then carefully glued them into place. Again, it is designed into the kit to have a bit of extra play value, and these wheels could freely rotate if you are careful, but again, I'm not too worried about that. And we're nearly there with the kit. Almost everything is done now. The only thing left is the Land Rover. This Land Rover doesn't come with any clear glazing, so I've got some clear plastic from a bit of packaging, which I cut into more manageable parts. With the use of a little super glue, this was then glued onto the inside areas where the windows would be. This Land Rover is incredibly simple. It's effectively just a box that needs to be glued together. It's also not particularly well detailed. Before adding the other side of the vehicle on though, I did have to make sure that I glued in the axles. Again, this is designed with play value in mind, so these are supposed to be just press fit, but I'm not too worried about that, so I'm quite happy to glue them in. And with that done, I glued on the roof, and to ensure that the clear glazing I've installed remains clear, I applied some Vallejo liquid mask to these areas. And then, as if by magic, the entire vehicle was primed, again using Humbrol No. 1 Primer Grey. I decided that I'd paint this one a little differently though. For now, I'm going to be using Humbrol No. 25 thinned down with some Humbrol acrylic thinners. A few thin coats of this were hand painted onto the vehicle. The lower side of the vehicle was painted with Humbrol No. 32 dark grey, whilst the upper canvas part was painted with Vallejo English Uniform. With that done, I carefully removed the liquid mask which has protected the clear glazing, and then carefully picked out various elements of the vehicle in Vallejo silver. This included the headlamps and the various trim elements, which may have been typical of a vehicle of this type from the time. I then glued into place the wheels on their relevant axles, and I think that this Land Rover is now more or less finished, so we can add it to the diorama. And speaking of the diorama, I've got this MDF disc which I laser cut a little while ago on my laser cutter. I've also got these sheets of bush concrete slabs, which I think will form part of this base. I cut a section of the concrete slabs from the larger sheet, and then using some general purpose glue, I stuck it down onto my MDF circle. I would trim around the outside to make it nice and neat. For the other half of this diorama base, I want to have it as grass. So I mixed up some Humbrol 29 dark earth with some PVA glue to create a sticky kind of mud. I then sprinkled down some various scatters. The first up was these sort of dried patches of foliage, and then some static grass. After a good coverage of this, the excess was removed and saved for reuse. I then glued the launcher into position on the concrete base, as well as the Land Rover and the trailer, trying to pick positions which I thought would look kind of realistic, as if this was some sort of loading or unloading operation. As the figures have a small amount of wire protruding from their feet, a relevant sized hole was made in the diorama base, and with a little glue they were then also pushed into those relevant locations. I added on the missile, but this is not glued in case I want to move it around the diorama and display it on the trailer or the launcher. And with that, my build of the Bristol Bloodhound from Airfix is complete. So there we have it. This Airfix Vintage Classic Bristol Bloodhound is now complete. It's a 1/76 scale model, so not quite 1/72nd, and people do ask me on occasion, why did Airfix, or still do Airfix, make 1/76 scale kits? And this stems from back in the day when 1/76 was a popular model train scale. It still is. It's 00 gauge here in the UK, and Airfix and other manufacturers made their product lines sort of fit in with that, so you could have your trains and your tanks, etc., all working together with extra play value, which is why these kits were designed with play value as well, because in those days model trains and these sort of kits were considered almost like an extension of toys. I mean, they effectively are plastic toys, and we just play with them in slightly different ways. So whilst I think it's quite fun that this kit does have that extra functionality, supposedly you could drive your Land Rover around with its wheels rotating if you'd glued everything together properly and they were still allowed to rotate. You could have the trailer hooked up behind it and that, again, pivoting and having freely rotating wheels. You could have your launcher pivoting and raised or lowered. You could have your trailer raised or lowered with your missile on it as well. So there was play value here. The fact that the figures came with bases on meant you could move them around and position them however you were wanting to use them. Naturally, I've gone for a diorama, so mine are pretty much set now in their ways. If I'd had this as a child, I'm sure I would have had hours of fun with it. But for this build, it only took me a couple of days. On the whole, I think in my notes in my book, it took me 3 days to complete this one. There are still some issues with the kit. There is some flash. Some of the parts are a little bit questionably detailed. Some of the fit was a little bit off as well. And there are ejector pin marks in a few places, which some of you may be able to notice. And there are mold seams as well that I probably didn't address as much as I probably could have. Let's talk a little bit about the kit though. This kit, according to the Airfix box, was tooled or designed back in 1971, but I can find evidence of this kit existing before that, dating as early as 1960, which I would be more inclined to believe. I'm not entirely sure if Airfix have perhaps put the wrong date on their box. It is entirely possible it could be a typo, or maybe they just had lost those kinds of records. But it would seem online that this kit had a version back in the 60s, and I would be inclined to believe that to be the case, given the fact that this has a very simple design to it. I've built kits which were designed by Airfix in the 70s, and they are a little bit more refined. That Land Rover, for example, is very clunky, very simple, and not the best kit in the world. It doesn't come with any clear parts either, which is a bit disappointing. I just feel as though there are a lot of design elements here which lend themselves to being more of a 1960s product than a 1970s one. According to the box, you get 96 parts included in the kit, which is a relatively good number of parts, but again, it's not a massive kit, so some of these parts are quite small. And bearing in mind, of course, that you don't actually get any transfers included in the kit, and I had to use my own ones to represent them, I think transfers for the markings on the Bloodhound and even a license plate number or something like that would have been nice to have in the kit. I'm sure that probably the trailer and the launcher may have had some sort of stencils relating to their use as well printed on them. But there are no decals in here, which is a cost-saving method, which I would have liked to have thought would have kept the price of this kit down. However, at the time I built this kit, the RRP here in the UK was £10.99, which I think, given the fact there's no clear parts and there's no transfers included, is a little high, especially given that when you've completed all the elements inside the kit, you haven't actually got a massive model. So personally though, I would prefer to have got this a few pounds cheaper. But on the whole, I did have quite a lot of fun building it up into this little diorama, and I'm actually really quite happy with how it looks at the end. It's definitely something a little bit different to the usual aircraft that I build and display on my shelf. I would be interested in getting some more sort of kits that build up into dioramas in the future, but I think I'll need to clear out a bit of my stash and get some more builds completed before I can justify putting more kits into there. But I think though this is probably time to wrap this one up. This is an old kit which does suffer from excess flash, mould misalignments, and the odd gap here and there, not to mention a lack of fine detail. but interestingly has been designed with a bit of play value in mind. Perhaps it's a little bit expensive for what you're getting, seeing as there's no clear parts or transfers, and the finished product at the end is relatively small. But if you're looking for something fun to build up into a diorama and seeing how you can put a different twist on things, it's certainly an interesting kit to add to the stash. Let me know what you think of my build down in the comments, and also if you think my assessment of this kit was fair. Once again, massive thanks to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel, but if you'd like to support the channel in other ways, there is more information underneath the video. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. Airfix Bristol Bloodhound, I think. Build and review. That's what it is. I think these results will be good enough for viewing from... Oh, there's someone at the door. I had also used this yellow paint on a band around... No, I haven't. That's tape. That's not paint. And mould lines as well, which I may not have necessarily addressed, as probably could... As I probably... Oh, there's a postman. Nothing for me, unfortunately. No model kits for me. Where was I?